We do have a full house. Welcome, everybody. So, just out of curiosity, how many people have never been to an HCLL program before? Do we have any newcomers here? Not very many. And how many of you have been coming to HCLL for at least 5 years? Looking at those hands. Now, how about 10 years? All right. And if we go for 20 and you raise your hand, you're lying. Because our 20th anniversary isn't until next year. Then we'll be having a celebration of 20 years of HCLL. But welcome, whether it's your first time or your 100th time, we're glad that you are here. Today we have one.
So, I've got an interesting story to tell today, and it's about the Olympics. Specifically, the Olympics held in 1936 in Berlin, Germany. And that's okay. I'd like everybody to get in and get seated. So these Olympics were held, my tagline says the Nazi Games, and that's because these Olympics were held at a point where you could say the Nazi regime was kind of a work in progress. There were signs of bad things, but I don't think anybody really understood at that time the full implications of what was to come and what we were to learn and so forth. And as a result of these Olympics, the Nazis were able to present a particular image to the world. That's why we refer to them as the Nazi Games. Now, the Olympics might be the biggest sporting spectacle we have. You could make comparisons between the Olympics and the Super Bowl or the World Cup and so on and so forth, but you talk about something that everybody around the world is interested in. I find there are even people who don't like sports seem to be interested in watching the Olympics sometimes. So I think it's probably the biggest sporting spectacle we have, and I would say that we probably all possess kind of a romanticized image of the Olympics. It should be about the skill and ability of the athlete. And politics should not play a role in the Olympics. But in fact, politics have played a very large role in the Olympics, and this might be the most notorious example. So let's just start. So what is the purpose of the Olympics? So I'm going to go to the International Olympic Committee. This is the supreme governing body of the Olympics. And, they're in charge. So what do they say is the purpose or the goal of the Olympics? It's to contribute to building a peaceful and better world by educating youth through sport practiced without discrimination of any kind in a spirit of friendship, solidarity, and fair play. Now let's just highlight some words there. A peaceful and better world without discrimination, friendship, solidarity, and fair play. Doesn't that sound wonderful? Or let's get another opinion, a little different angle. This guy, his name is Pierre de Coubertin, and they call him the father of the modern Olympics. So I'll explain what that means in a moment. But here's what he saw as the purpose of the Olympics. Promoting peace and unity, building bridges, break down cultural barriers. Again, that sounds wonderful. But over the years, we have seen and been subjected to a variety of images. Here's one example. This goes back to 2014 when the Winter Games were held in Sochi, Russia. Or let's go to 1980 when the Summer Games were being held in Moscow. And in 1980, the United States, we decided to boycott those Olympics because of actions the Russians had been taking and been involved in. So we boycotted the 1980 Olympics in Moscow. Then 4 years later, 1984, we are hosting the Olympics in Los Angeles. And probably to return the favor, they boycotted the 1984 Olympics. You boycotted our games, we're going to boycott your games. Or go to 1968. The games are held in Mexico City, and we have what's called the Black Power Salute on the medal stand. Or 1972, the Summer Games are held in Munich, Germany. We have what's called the Munich Massacre. During the Olympics, Palestinian terrorists broke into the Olympic Village and killed a number of members of the Israeli Olympic team. So it's pretty hard to deny that politics have played a very large role in the Olympics. Now, one group very interested in these Olympics is the Holocaust Museum out in Washington. And they have a particular perspective, of course, and they have a section of their museum devoted to these Olympics. And this is a little bit of a long quote from the Holocaust Museum, but it's interesting. It says, Nazi Germany used the 36 Olympics for propaganda purposes. They promoted an image of a new, strong, and united Germany, while masking the regime's targeting of Jews and Roma, as well as Germany's growing militarism. So, now the way I tell the story, I have 5 sections. The first one is the history of the Olympics. So I'll go back to ancient Greece here, up to the modern era. The second section is the rise of the Nazis. And I have to be very clear about this section. I do not consider myself an expert on the Nazi regime, and this will not be an in-depth analysis of the Nazi regime. It'll be a quick overview of how the Nazis came to power. So you have the history of the Olympics, the rise of the Nazis, and then in the third section I'll talk about how they intersected in 1936 with these Olympics. The fourth section, for lack of a better title, I called it Individual Stories. And this is just going to be one right after the other, a number of individuals and groups involved in the 36 Olympics, and there are a lot of them. I'm just taking a little bit of a cross-section across the top there. And then the last section, I refer to this one as a complicated legacy. When you talk about the 1936 Olympics, there's a lot of bad stuff to focus on, but as I will share with you in that last section, the way the Germans put on the games, the way they staged the Olympics. They did a lot of things that were new and different, that had never been done before, and it's almost as if they created a blueprint for how to do the Olympics. And folks, we are still following that blueprint to this very day. So that's why the last section, a complicated legacy. All right, so now, first section, history of the Olympics. So we'll go back to ancient Greece. The first Olympic Games are held in 776 BC in a town called Olympia. Now, this is a period of almost constant fighting, so they decide, let's have an athletic competition and call a truce. Maybe this will help in the long run. Well, the first Olympics was actually not just athletic in nature, but also a religious festival. It was honoring the Greek god Zeus. Historians think that the very first Olympics consisted of exactly one event, and it was a foot race of about 190 meters. Now, I don't think there was any attempt to try to measure a specific distance. I think it was just, we're going to have a race from point A to point B. Well, eventually they had about 20 different events, and the games did not move. They were always held in this town called Olympia. They were held every 4 years for more than 1,000 years. So we now have a new word, Olympiad, which is a measure of time. Games are held every 4 years for more than 1,000 years. Now, we move into roughly about 350 to 400 AD. The Greeks are now under Roman rule. And the Romans are Christians, and they don't like this idea of a festival honoring Zeus. They called it a pagan ritual. So the Romans decided these Olympics are going to be halted. Then there were some stadiums and other structures that had been built to host the games, and those things are destroyed. Later an earthquake, followed by a flood. So these now become buried ruins. And those ruins are not discovered until the 1700s. And then during the 1800s, archaeologists, historians start to unearth these ruins. And we started to learn about this history of the Olympics back in ancient Greece. Well, that leads me to this man. I quoted from him a moment ago, Pierre de Coubertin. He's called the father of the modern Olympics. Now, he is living in France. He's an educator and historian, and he's very interested in how does sport or physical education play a role in the way a student learns. So, those ancient Olympics was sort of a natural intersection of his interests. So he studied those. Well, during in the process of studying the ancient Olympics, he comes up with an idea to bring the Olympics back. So almost single-handedly, he pulls together a group in 1894 called the International Congress of Paris for the reestablishment of the Olympic Games, bringing people from a number of countries. And this group meets and they decide this is a good idea. So now we're going to bring the Olympics back. We're going to move in what is now referred to as the modern era. Remember, I called Pierre de Coubertin the father of the modern Olympics because this was his idea, essentially. So this group meets, they decide this is a good idea. We will bring the Olympics back. But then they thought, we should come up with some guiding principles that will take us into this modern era. They came up with 5. The 5 guiding principles are, number 1, the games would be held every 4 years, just like the ancient games were. Second, the competition would be limited to adults. And what they meant were adult males. Number 3, the competition would be limited to amateurs. Now, I'm sure most of the people in the room remember a period when the Olympics were about amateur athletics. Remember that time? And it just felt like some of these countries are treating their athletes like professionals. It's not fair. Here in the United States, we were at least trying to keep things amateur. Now, that focus on amateur athletics comes from these guiding principles in 1894. Now, that has been thrown out. That doesn't exist anymore, and I'll talk about that in a moment, but that's where it came from. The 4th guiding principle is the contest going into the modern era would be modern in nature. So in other words, by the 1800s, we had things like the 100-meter dash and the 200-meter dash. So we'll do things that make sense to people in the modern era and not try to replicate the events that were held in ancient Greece. The 5th guiding principle is instead of always being held in one city, they would move from city to city. So, that's 1894. The first games of the modern era were held in 1896 in Athens. And they brought in 14 countries, represented 245 athletes, all men. Now, just for comparison, I looked it up. The last time we had the Summer Olympics happened in 2016 in Brazil. 200 countries represented by more than 10,000 athletes. So this is where it started and look where it's come. Now some of those modern games, the early modern games, the first ones in 1896 are held in Athens. The next ones were held in Paris in 1900. And then something interesting happened in 1904. 1904 Olympics were held in St. Louis, Missouri. St. Louis, Missouri. And the participation rate in the 1904 Olympics was very low. And if you think about it, it makes perfect sense. It's a lot of these teams, a lot of these athletes are coming from Europe. If you live in Europe and it's 1904, St. Louis, Missouri is a hard place to get to. You have to sail across the ocean, then get on a train and go to the center of this big continent. So a lot of these teams, a lot of these countries just took a pass. We're not even going to bother sending a team. Well, then the next ones, 08, those are held in London, and a lot of those teams, a lot of those countries that had sat out came back in. I have a extra chair here too if you want to use this one. I'll just use that to hold my water bottle. You're welcome to use it. So in 1908, they come back in. So then it was pretty clear. There's a future here. We just have to be more careful about where we hold the games. Some of the highlights of the modern era. The first Winter Olympics are held in 1924 in France. There were no games held during these two periods that go with the two world wars, of course. The 1932 games, the ones immediately preceding the 36 Olympics I'll be talking about, those were held in Los Angeles. Now, as the Germans, as they're looking at hosting the 36 games, one factor was we want to do it bigger and better than the Americans did it 4 years earlier. That became a little bit of a factor. Some of the first women participated in 1900, and then, get this, it was not until 2012 that all teams sent women as part of their teams. It wasn't that long. In 1988, the International Olympic Committee finally threw in the towel. We give up. We're not going to try to treat to make the Olympics be about amateur athletes. We're going to open the doors and anybody can participate. It does not matter what their status is. Professional, amateur, doesn't matter. So that decision is made in 88, right after the Summer Games. And then 1992, the next Olympics, was the year we sent all of those NBA players, we called it the Dream Team. So that's the timing, see? And today, doesn't matter what your professional or amateur status is, anybody can participate in the Olympics. So there's a structure here. This is a big organization. At the top, you've got the International Olympic Committee, representing, I think there's over 100 members on the committee, and they have representatives from all over the world. And then most countries will have their own Olympic committee running things just for their country, picking their teams and so forth. And then we also have what are called federations. So these are related to specific sports. So you have the Gymnastics Federation and the Swimming Federation and so forth. They're coming up with the rules and the scoring for their specific sports. Well, the decision to award the 36 games to Berlin. First of all, this is the decision of the International Olympic Committee, and it's still this way. When the IOC was looking at where should we hold the 36 Olympics, one factor they took into account was 20 years earlier, 1916, Germany was supposed to host the Olympics, but those games were canceled because of World War I. So they missed the chance. Now, of course, after World War I, because of their own actions, Germany is ostracized. They're held out, they're not invited to the Olympics, other events and so forth, they're ostracized from the world. But now some time has gone by, and there was this sense that maybe it's time to bring Germany back in, and they missed the chance to host the Olympics back in 1916. So in 1931, the IOC votes unanimously to award the 36 Olympics to Berlin. And that decision was really made before the Nazis are on the scene or of any real consequence. Okay? So that is my lead-in to section 2, the rise of the Nazis. So World War I, people referred to it as the Great War, the war to end all wars. The fighting stops on Armistice Day in 1918, and then it's a matter of negotiating peace treaties. So the most important one out of this is called the Treaty of Versailles. It's signed in the middle of 1919, and the Treaty of Versailles requires Germany to accept full responsibility for losses and damages they had caused during the war. It requires Germany to give up lands they had seized, reduce their military on a permanent basis, and it requires Germany to pay reparations, pay money to other countries to compensate those other countries for losses and damages. So now the treaty is in effect, we're into the 20s, and in hindsight, the amount of the reparations was simply too big. It's roughly the equivalent of today having a $400 billion liability. So you have Germany, first of all, their economy was in rough shape anyway because of the war, and then you lay this great big liability on top of them. And so for a while they try to make the payments, and then they ended up just printing money. That leads to inflation. And then you move into the 30s, and now there's a depression, and it was not just a depression in the United States, it affects the entire world. So in Germany, people are feeling like we've been trying to make these payments. We accepted responsibility, but you know what? We were also humiliated in the process. That's creating this sentiment. There's just no reason to feel optimistic that we're going to be able to get out from under this big liability. So they're looking for some reason to be optimistic, to move forward, and that creates an opening for this guy to step in. Adolf Hitler is a member of the National Socialist German Workers' Party, or the Nazi Party. Hitler and the party are unapologetically racist and anti-Semitic. They are blaming others for the problems Germany has been experiencing. Hitler starts giving speeches on behalf of the Nazi Party, and he's saying things like, we're just going to stop paying the reparations, we'll just forget about the liability, we're going to build our military back up again, direct violation of the Treaty of Versailles, and we're going to bring Germany back to the position of strength it had before the war. Well, he's so dynamic that people start to think this is what we're looking for. This is the reason to be optimistic. So people start to join the party. Then the party starts to grow in size and influence. Then in 1932, Hitler decides to run for president of Germany. Well, the man he runs against is Paul von Hindenburg, and he'd been a military commander back in the war, becomes president in 1925, and then was trying to decide if he was going to run for re-election. And some people got to him and said, we need you to run against Adolf Hitler. We think you're the only one who can defeat Adolf Hitler. Well, Hindenburg doesn't want to run for re-election in 1932 because at the time he was 84 years old and in poor health. But for the good of the country, I will run. So he runs against Hitler and defeats him. Now, then the next thing is a big task for a German president is appointing the chancellor. Now this is sort of like the prime minister in other governments. This is the person who will oversee the operations of the government. This person is appointed by the president and then is supposed to report to both the president and the Reichstag, or the parliament or legislature. So trying to decide who to appoint as chancellor. Well, some people decided, got to him, said, we think you should appoint Hitler. And I think the thought might have been something along the lines of, if we keep him out, he will continue to cause problems and be this rabble-rouser and so on and so forth. But maybe if we bring him in, now he's at the table when these decisions are made, maybe it'll somehow keep him in check or under wraps. So he appoints Hitler as chancellor. But because the Nazis have grown in size and influence, they are also influencing the Reichstag, or the legislature. And almost immediately the Reichstag passes this bill called the Enabling Act, which sort of turned the keys to the government over to Hitler. He can pretty much do whatever he wants without getting permission from anybody. And then, the very next year, Hindenburg died. And this is the point where Hitler said, it's over, I'm in charge. Now, among other things, one thing people brought up is, well, what are we going to do about the Olympics? You know, we're supposed to host the Olympics in a couple of years. And Hitler, remember that decision was made back in 1931. Now we're up to about 1934 here. And Hitler wasn't a fan of the Olympics. He called it an infamous festival dominated by Jews, and he thought it was a disgrace that Germans might have to compete against what he referred to as non-Aryans. So he was not inclined to move forward on hosting the Olympics. But then some people get to him and said, just think about the opportunity this presents. Just think about you can present an image to the world. And so, okay, they won him over. He's finally said, all right, I agree, we should host the Olympics. But then he says, if we are going to host the Olympics in 1936, we're going to do it bigger and better than has ever been done. Germany ended up spending $30 million to host the Olympics. That was more than had been spent on all previous Olympics combined. And then Hitler goes on record as saying he thought Germany should become the permanent host of the Olympics. So, of course, that never happens, but it shows you how he goes from one extreme, I don't want to host the Olympics, to now he's all in and we should be the permanent host. So, all right, so now I talked about the history of the Olympics, the rise of the Nazis. Now I'm going to go to this third section. Excuse me. So, if you just start, just think about the word propaganda. Okay. Information, especially of a biased or misleading nature, used to promote a political cause or point of view. All right, so you talk about a point of view here. Let's talk about Nazi racism. Everybody is put into superior and inferior races. At the top are the Northern Europeans, followed by the Asians, the Africans, others, and at the very bottom are the Jews. So Germany, the Nazis are blaming others, especially the Jews, for the problems Germany has been experiencing. Now, this is all going on in Germany, and a group here in the United States, the Jews in the United States, are watching this. And they're starting to be very concerned about the treatment of their brethren. So they start to call attention to things that they're hearing, things that are going on. And then they learned that German athletic organizations have received an instruction: you are only to allow Aryans to participate on your teams. So the Jews in the United States start to call attention to this. They're supposed to host the Olympics in a couple of years. They're going to discriminate in how they choose their teams. That's not fair. That's not right. Well, then the German athletic leaders learned about this, and they put out a statement, well, we promise when it comes to the Olympics, we won't discriminate. We'll allow anyone to participate on our teams. But the Jews in the United States don't believe this. They don't buy it. So they call on the American Olympic Committee to boycott the 36 games. Well, one group very interested in watching all this are the black athletes in this country. They have, of course, been subjected to great racism themselves, and they're trying to decide, should we support the boycott of a racist regime or should we participate? The NAACP at the time was actually recommending boycott. So this is an issue that is just swirling around. And so forth. And this is really the first time in history anybody had talked about an idea of boycotting the Olympic Games. Well, the United States is leading the way. Gallup polls are pretty new in the 30s, but there was one in the mid-30s that said 57% of Americans thought we should boycott the Olympics. The United States is leading the way, and there were a few other countries sort of sitting on the sidelines, waiting to see what we're going to do. If the United States participates, we'll probably participate. If they boycott, we'll probably boycott. They're waiting to see what we are going to do. Now, one man steps into this. Now, he feels like somebody's got to take charge. How are we going to decide? This is this controversy, this issue is just swirling and swirling, and how are we going to resolve this? So this man steps in to take charge, and at the time he's the president of the American Olympic Committee. Now he also holds the image that the Olympics should be free of politics, and so he didn't like this idea. When he hears about the idea of a boycott of the Olympics, he called it a Jewish plot to undermine the games. Now, most historians who study Avery Brundage, and I'm actually going to refer back to him a couple of times during today, most people who studied his life think he held anti-Semitic views. So when he hears about this, he calls it a Jewish plot to undermine the games. So then he says, somebody's got to take charge. And he announces in 1934, I'm going to make a trip to Berlin. I will meet with the German leaders. I will ask them to their faces, will you discriminate? Or will you allow anyone to participate based on skill and ability? So Brundage's trip to Berlin in 1934 is actually kind of an important part of the story. He goes to Berlin, and it's important to point out, he doesn't speak German. So he meets with the German leaders, and they present this tightly controlled view. All the bad stuff is hidden away. And they promised him, well, when it comes to the Olympics, we will allow anyone to participate. It'll be based on skill and ability and so forth. So Brundage essentially takes them at their word, comes home and says, my recommendation is we should participate. We should not boycott the Olympics. And that is what tipped us over. All right? We're going to participate. And then those other countries waiting to see what we're going to do, they sort of fell in line behind the United States. One person very involved in Brundage's trip is Joseph Goebbels. He's the minister of propaganda, and he realized what a chance this was to show the world the image they wanted to show the world. So he orders Berlin to be cleaned up. There were businesses with anti-Jewish signs. The signs are to be taken down, and then people living in Berlin are told, you have to be on your best behavior. The world will be watching. The world will be visiting. Need to be on your best behavior. So anybody who went there, anybody who paid attention, just saw this sanitized version of what was really happening, what was going on in Germany. Now, this is the first time anybody had talked about a boycott, and also really the first time anybody had said, we're going to, politics are going to intrude on the Olympics. And it's pretty clear Hitler was able to hide what he was doing, what he was thinking, and what he was planning. Up to this point, you could kind of say the Olympics had sort of been viewed as individual versus individual. But in 1936, we started to pay a lot of attention, country versus country, nationalizing the Olympics. And I think it's probably pretty clear. If the Olympics, if this boycott had happened, I think the future would have been different somehow. You can't pin it down exactly how or exactly what I mean, but it just something would have been different in the future. So, all right. Now I'm going to this fourth section. Like I said, for lack of a better title, I call it individual stories. So I'm just going to talk about people and groups involved in the 1936 Olympics. There's one right after the other. The common thread, of course, is they were involved in the Olympics in '36. So I'll start this section with the most famous athlete from those games, Jesse Owens. He's a track athlete out of Ohio State. In college, he sets a whole bunch of records. He qualifies for the Olympics and actually wins 4 gold medals at the 36 games. Now, I have 2 stories about Jesse Owens that I want to mention. Lutz Long. He's a German long jumper. He is competing in the long jump against Jesse Owens. So they are having the preliminary rounds of the long jump, and actually Jesse Owens scratches twice, meaning he steps over the line. Do it one more time and you're disqualified. You don't move to the finals. So Lutz Long decides to help the guy he's competing against. He talks to Owens and he says, I'm going to lay a towel on the ground next to the spot where you take off from, and that'll help you to see it. Then you can make a decent jump in the last chance of the preliminaries, and then we can both move to the finals and compete. So he does that. Owens makes a decent jump in the last one of the preliminaries, and then these 2 guys each won the gold and silver medals. Jesse Owens wins the gold, and the guy who helped him wins the silver. And after the results are announced, the first person to come up and congratulate Jesse Owens was none other than Lutz Long. There's a picture, I don't have it here, but of him with his arm around Jesse Owens' shoulders. Now that had to be a pretty bold thing to do in Nazi Germany in 1936. Well, they developed a friendship, and they stayed in touch for a while, but then, unfortunately, Lutz Long died in World War II. Now, I've had a couple people tell me that there's a theory out there, and I don't know how you verify this, but the theory is that probably because of this incident that Lutz Long, when he went into the war, was sent straight to the front lines. And I don't know if that's true or not, but it's sort of not hard to believe. Anyway, so the second story about Jesse Owens is one that is very commonly believed and often repeated. And that is the story that Adolf Hitler snubbed Jesse Owens. And this story is actually a myth. And I want to tell you the story of this. So it's the first day of the Olympics. Hitler is there, and he was calling gold medalists up to his special box, meeting with them and congratulating them. Now, most of them are German. So now it's later in the first day, and it looked like it was going to rain. So Hitler decides to leave. On the evening of the first day of the Olympics, a black American man named Cornelius Johnson wins the gold medal in the high jump. Now, Hitler wasn't there to call him up and meet with him and congratulate him. And then, of course, it's pretty doubtful he would have done that. But he wasn't there. So then the president of the International Olympic Committee at the time hears about this, and he goes to Hitler the next day and said, please, we've just spent the last couple years with all this swirling controversy and discussion about discrimination and so forth. Please, don't pick and choose. Either meet with everybody or nobody. And essentially, Hitler decided he wasn't going to meet with anybody. Probably because he knew that if he met with everybody, he might have to shake the hand of a black man or a Jew. So he decides he's not going to meet with anybody. Now the press hears about this story, and the first versions of the story, instead of saying it was Cornelius Johnson, they said it was Jesse Owens. That's how it started, and it persists to this day. And actually, later in life, Jesse Owens said, Hitler didn't snub me, it was FDR who snubbed me. The president didn't even send me a telegram. All right. The next individual story is something I get asked about a lot. There is a book called Boys in the Boat. I bet some people in the audience have read this. It's a very popular book. It's one of those books sort of making the rounds of the Book of the Month Club. This is the story of the U.S. rowing team, and they're kind of a ragtag group of guys from the University of Washington. Tough backgrounds, poor, they pull together, qualify for the Olympics, and they actually win the gold medal, just barely. And so this book is about their story, and boy, is it an interesting book, inspiring book, and then it has this backdrop of the 36 Olympics. So if you're looking to read something about these, this is a good one to start with. There's boys in the book. I get asked about it a lot. Another person we learned about through a book and a movie, and I actually was asked about this before I started, is a man named Louis Zamperini. Now, he competed in the 1936 Olympics, although he did not medal. But the reason we've heard of him is he goes into World War II, and he and a couple other guys are shot down, and they spent 47 days in a raft in the Pacific. Ultimately captured by the Japanese and held in brutal, horrible conditions for over 2 years. When he was released, he eventually becomes a Christian evangelist focusing on forgiveness, and his story was made into a book and a movie called Unbroken. Now, Unbroken is largely about World War II forward, but it's worth mentioning that he competed in the 36 Olympics. Now, I like to take just a tiny little side story to this one. When I first started doing this particular presentation, I would get to this slide and I would say he had sort of an unremarkable performance in the 36 Olympics. Unremarkable. I thought that was a safe word. Then somebody said to me, "You try finishing 8th in the 5,000 meters at the Olympics." Very good point. So now I say he didn't medal. So, all right. Okay. Now, the next individual story is about this woman. Her name is Leni Riefenstahl. She's a filmmaker. And as the Nazis are coming to power, Hitler asked her to create a movie, and it's called Triumph of the Will. And this is a propaganda film. It presents the Nazis in the greatest possible image. And then Hitler thinks she does such a nice job with that, he asks her to create a movie about the Olympics, and it's called Olympia. Now, Olympia is sort of an interesting movie. She must have had a huge crew. They must have had cameras everywhere. It's incredible how many, anytime you see any footage from the Olympics, and we're actually going to watch a little bit of it, I'm pretty sure every bit of that came from her crew. They were all over the place, and then she takes all this footage and condenses it into a movie. There's no dialogue. It's set to music. It's kind of presenting the strength and beauty of the athletes. Lots of slow motion, muscles rippling, and so on and so forth. And set to music. It's sort of an interesting movie, but anyway. So now you know that she is never, after World War II, she's never charged with any war crimes. But she was branded as a propagandist and a fan of Adolf Hitler. And see, she lives until 2003. And she spent the rest of her life fighting that characterization. I've seen interviews with her, they're in German, and I don't speak German, but she's pounding the table. I was not a propagandist. I was not a fan of Adolf Hitler. I was a filmmaker hired to do a job, and I did my job the best I could. But historians say it's pretty clear she was in his camp. She was about helping him with what he wanted to do. Another person from the 36 Olympics, her name is Helene Meyer. She's a German fencer. She wins the silver medal, and on the medal stand gives the Nazi salute. But the reason that I'm talking about her, Helene Meyer's father was Jewish. So the Germans held her up as an example of somebody being non-Aryan. Now, from everything I've read, Helene Meyer did not consider herself to be Jewish. But the Germans held her up as an example. See, we don't discriminate. We allow Jews on our teams, but it's also worth mentioning there were no other Jews on the German Olympic team. So the one example they were holding up was somebody who doesn't even consider herself to be Jewish, and on the medal stand gives the Nazi salute. Next individual story. These two guys, Marty Glickman and Sam Stoller, they're members of the U.S. relay team. They qualified for the Olympics. They're in Berlin. They're ready to compete, and at the last minute, U.S. Olympic officials came to them and said, "We're worried about the relay. We need a little more speed. We're going to replace the two of you with Jesse Owens and Ralph Metcalfe." Now, it's pretty hard to deny that Owens and Metcalfe were faster than these two guys. So why was this decision made? Why was it made at the last minute? And a lot of people, if you remember I talked about that guy Avery Brundage, you know, the president of the American Olympic Committee, takes the Nazis at their word, fights the boycott and so forth. A lot of people think this may have had his fingerprints on it, that he was worried that if these two guys competed and if they won a gold medal, it might show off Adolf Hitler, because out of the entire United States track and field team at the 1936 Olympics, these are the only two Jews. 60 years later, the American Olympic Committee admitted this mistake. They said this was a terrible story. It was done for the wrong reasons. By that point, Sam Stoller had died. Marty Glickman, actually, he went on to a career as a sports broadcaster, kind of an illustrious career, actually. And he's still alive, and I think I read that they held a luncheon and gave him a little plaque or something to try to make up for his chance to compete in the Olympics. One more individual story. This guy is named Ernest Johnson. So leading up to the Olympics, he is the United States representative on the International Olympic Committee. He does not believe the Olympic Games should be held in Nazi Germany. So he brings it up and brings it up and brings it up, and it is as if the rest of the committee got tired of listening to him and they kicked him off the committee. They kicked him off in July, then the games were held in August, and then after the games are over, things sort of settled down, and guess who replaced him as our representative on the committee? Avery Brundage. Guy who fights the boycott, takes the Nazis at their word. Now, then, fast forward to 2002. The Winter Games are held in Salt Lake City, and we learned about a bribery scandal. Some Salt Lake City officials bribed some members of the International Olympic Committee to have those games awarded to Salt Lake City. Well, when that all is uncovered and it comes out, several members of the IOC were kicked off of the committee. So in the history of the International Olympic Committee, the only people ever kicked off of the committee are the people involved in the bribery scandal and the one guy, the lone voice, who did not believe the Olympic Games should be held in Nazi Germany. All right, so now going to this last section. And again, I call this a complicated legacy. So the games are over, and the International Olympic Committee thought, boy, these are the best Olympic Games we've ever seen. And for people paying attention, for people watching, they thought that IOC must really have its act together, because look what they were able to accomplish. The stature rose in people's eyes. But then a decision was made that in hindsight seems like a horrible decision. And that was a decision about the 1940 Winter Games. Now, I'll tell you about that story. So the 1940 Winter Games were scheduled to be held in Japan. Of course, Japan was involved in a lot of bad things leading into the war. So in 1938, Japan backs out. All right, so now the IOC is sort of backed into a corner. We don't have a lot of time. We need somebody to host the 1940 Winter Games. Aha! Germany did such a nice job back in 1936. They asked Germany to host the 1940 Winter Games. Now maybe, you could argue that in 1936 we didn't know. We didn't understand. By 1939 it was very clear there are very bad things going on here. And of course later in 1939 Germany invades Poland and so on and so forth. And those games ended up being canceled anyway because of the outbreak of the war. But in hindsight, it seems like no matter how much you were backed into a corner, there had to be a better decision than going back to Nazi Germany in 1939. So in hindsight, this just seems like a horrible, horrible decision. Today, the Olympic Games broadcast rights are a huge part of the Olympics. Well, the first Olympics broadcast over the air, 1936. They were actually televised. Now, this is only in Berlin. They set up these rooms called salons. You would go there and watch the TV. Now look at those screens. And just imagine how bad the picture was. But this was so unique. They say that a ticket to go there and look at that hardback wooden chair and watch a horrible picture on a tiny little screen. That was so coveted, that ticket was so coveted, it was harder to get than a ticket to go sit in the stadium and watch it in person. And the 36 Olympics are the first ones broadcast on live radio, now on a small scale, but you know, all right, so today broadcast rights are a huge part of the Olympics. Started in 1936. Another thing that came out of these games is a focus on medal counts. I mentioned earlier about how the 36 games are starting to be the one where we really nationalize things, started to look at country versus country. Now, it doesn't mean they didn't keep track before that, but we started to really pay attention. And this is kind of interesting because Germany does come out way ahead, followed by the United States, and then all the other countries are way behind. Again, doesn't mean we didn't keep track, but it really started to pay a lot of attention in 36. And then we have something that came out of these Olympics related to saluting. Now, here's an image we're familiar with. You might not know, there is a gesture known as the Olympic salute. And this goes back to the ancient Olympics. And I have a picture of a statue giving the Olympic salute. And here it is. Oops. So, after 1936, we stopped using the Olympic salute. It's not used today. But at the 36 Olympics, you have pictures like this. Here's the French team walking around the track during the opening ceremonies. And later on, I guess those guys said, well, we weren't doing the Nazi salute, we were doing the Olympic salute. But if you're sitting in that stadium like that day, what do you think they're doing? So, never use it anymore. And actually, this next thing I'm going to talk about is related to saluting, but it has nothing to do with the Olympics. Somebody told me about this, and I thought I had to go and research it. There used to be something called the Bellamy salute. You'd say the Pledge of Allegiance. You'd hold your hand out, palm up toward the flag, but because that kind of looks like the Nazi salute, we changed it in 1942. And today we put our hands over our hearts when we say the Pledge of Allegiance. Has nothing to do with the Olympics, but it shows you just this whole saluting and the resemblance to the Nazi salute and so forth. Another thing that generated some controversy at the time, and to a certain degree still does, has to do with dipping your country's flag to the host country leader. Now this is not a picture from the Olympics. I use it because it shows what I'm talking about. Dipping the flag. In this case, the American flag is straight up and those other flags have been dipped. Just move it forward a few inches. That's what I mean by dipping your flag. Well, it was somewhat customary that most countries would dip their flag as in opening ceremonies. You're walking on the track, you dip your flag in front of the host country leader, in this case Adolf Hitler. But of course, in the United States, we have those customs about the flag, like it never touches the ground and so forth, and one of those customs says you never dip the United States flag as a sign of salute or respect to anyone, let alone the leader of another country. So we don't dip our flag. We got some flack, we got some criticism, and to this day, we don't dip our flag. But it's interesting because now in the age of social media, after the Olympics are held, then people get on Twitter and Facebook and they start arguing about, I think it looked like he dipped the flag. He's not supposed to dip the flag as you're walking along and the flag kind of moving. Hey, he dipped the flag. You're not supposed to do that. And then, no, he didn't. He was just walking. They argue about stuff like that. But this, to a certain extent, we get a little bit of flack. The other countries think we're being disrespectful. All right. So I talked about this guy a couple of times already. Just want to expand on it. This guy has a complicated legacy in his own right. He competed in the 1912 Olympics. He becomes the president of the American Olympic Committee for a quarter century. He's the one who takes the Nazis at their word, fights the boycott. And then he becomes, after Ernest Jahnke, remember, is kicked off of the IOC, he becomes our representative on the IOC, and then eventually becomes the president of the International Olympic Committee for another 20 years. His tenure ended, and it was a very combative period. He was fighting with everybody as they went along, and after 1972, that is the year of the Munich massacre, where terrorists killed members of the Israeli Olympic team, he gives a speech where he talks about how the games must go on, and I'm sure we would all agree, the games must go on. You can't let the terrorists win. But he threw in a couple of other things that were sort of jabs at other people or other groups and other members of the International Olympic Committee and so forth. And people just felt, wait, this is not the right time to bring those other things in. And it was very insensitive. So his tenure ends after that. And so you look at his career, and this guy devoted his whole life to the Olympics. But yet then he's got these black clouds hanging over, like taking the Nazis at their word, fighting the boycott, the insensitive remarks after the Munich massacre. I showed you the picture early on of the Black Power salute. Well, he reportedly was so outraged by that they were kicked out of the Olympics and stripped of their medals. And that was him. He was outraged by this. So you talk about a complicated legacy. This guy has a complicated legacy. So now I've got a couple of little video clips. I'm getting toward the end here, but this first one is. Oops, I'm sorry, I got ahead of myself. Sorry about that. Okay, I mentioned at the beginning. The Germans created a blueprint for how to do the Olympics. Some of the things they did that were new and different. They were the first ones in '36 to hold a torch relay. Now, the Olympic flame had been part of the games for a while, but they came up with an idea of lighting the flame in Greece and having a relay that culminates with somebody running into the stadium to light the cauldron. And you know what a big moment that is in the opening ceremonies today. Well, they were the first ones to do it in '36. They were the first ones to just go over the top in building these facilities and stadiums and build an elaborate Olympic village, the athletes to live in and so forth. And then have these opening and closing ceremonies with all of this pageantry, and those things all existed before '36, but they went over the top. And you know how those opening ceremonies, those are just the most elaborate thing you could ever possibly watch. You watch that, and I said that Germany spent $30 million at the time, so that's about the equivalent of $500 million today. And just out of curiosity, I looked this up. A couple years ago, they made an announcement that in 2028, the Summer Games are to be held in Los Angeles. All right, so in order to be awarded the Olympics, you have to make a bid. And I wanted to know, what was Los Angeles' bid for 2028 Olympics? $5.3 billion. Now, that doesn't mean Los Angeles has to come up with it. Most of it comes from sponsorships and advertising and broadcast rights and all those sort of things. But, look where we started, and then here's where we're going. And we're on this race to the top. Every Olympics, it's like, well, what can they do that's better than we did 4 years ago? I don't know where it might end. So, okay, so now I have a couple of short video clips. And this first one is just some footage from the Olympics. It's kind of an interesting collection of images and so forth. I think it's like a minute and a half long, but it's just interesting to see this stuff, so here we go.
The 1936 Olympic Games were awarded to Berlin, and Adolf Hitler laid careful plans to make them a showcase for Aryan supremacy.
Zur Feier der 11. Olympiade neuer Zeitrechnung als eröffnet.
But with the world watching, Jesse Owens, a black American, upstaged Hitler's racist agenda, setting new Olympic records while winning an unprecedented 4 gold medals in track and field. While Owens was being celebrated as the world's greatest athlete, the enraged Fuhrer stormed out of the stadium.
Okay, so again, it's just sort of interesting to see that. And again, this, I'm sure, was taken by Lenny Riefenstahl's crew. So this next one is a minute long, and it is of the 100-meter dash. Now, it's narrated in German, and I don't speak German, but I'm showing you this because I think it's really interesting. There's something to see. I bet I watched this thing 10 times before I saw something. And now I can't not see it. And so I'm going to tell you about it so you can see the first time. So it's a minute long. The 100-meter dash takes about 10 seconds. So they do a bunch of preliminary introduction and so forth, and you'll hear 3 American names, Jesse Owens, Ralph Metcalf, and Frank Wyckoff. Those are the 3 Americans in the 100-meter dash finals. But the thing that I saw after I watched it 10 times was once they get around to running the race, watch what a smooth runner Jesse Owens is compared to everybody else, okay? And it's pretty interesting to look at this. It's just a minute long and it's in German, so here we go.
Die Entscheidung im 100-Meter-Lauf. Die 6 schnellsten Läufer der Welt sind angetreten. Borgmeier, Wyckoff, Owens, Strandberg, Rosenberg und Metcalf. Liegt am Baum, Strandberg hinter ihm, Rosenberg nimmt sich heran. Metcalf folgt, Ziel! Sieger im 100-Meter-Lauf ist der Owens.
So, did you see what I was talking about? Amazing athlete. So, all right, I'm going to finish with one more quote from the Holocaust Museum. And again, they have a particular perspective on this, and this is it's just thought-provoking, if nothing else. Okay, here we go. Having rejected a proposed boycott of the 1936 Olympics, the United States and other Western democracies missed the opportunity to take a stand that contemporary observers claimed might have restrained Hitler and bolstered international resistance to Nazi tyranny. After the Olympics, Germany's expansionism and the persecution of Jews and other enemies of the state accelerated, culminating in World War II and the Holocaust. Now, as I said at the beginning, when you talk about the 1936 Olympics, there's a lot of bad stuff to focus on. But I called the last section a complicated legacy because, as I also shared with you, they did things that were new and different, and they created this blueprint for how to do the Olympics, and we're still following that blueprint they created to this very day. And that's why I called the last section a complicated legacy. And there we reached the end. And I thank you so much.